Most people know Maryland for blue crabs and the Baltimore Harbor. But if you look deeper, you find a state born in fire. This is the state where 400 men sacrificed themselves to save George Washington from total destruction. It's the state where the Union nearly crumbled from within during the Civil War. And it's the place where a lawyer watching a bombardment wrote the most famous song in American history. Small in size, but massive in impact. This is the violent and heroic history of Maryland. Located in the heart of the mid-Atlantic, Maryland is often called America in miniature because it packs almost every kind of terrain into one small state. From the sandy dunes of the Atlantic coast to the rolling mountains of the Appalachians in the west. But the state is truly defined by the massive body of water that splits it nearly in two, the Chesapeake Bay. But the story of Maryland isn't just about geography, it's about a radical idea. In the early 1600s, England was a dangerous place to be Catholic. If you didn't follow the Church of England, you faced fines, imprisonment, or worse. Enter George Calvert, the first Lord Baltimore. He envisioned a colony not for gold, like Virginia, or for strict Puritans, like Massachusetts, but a sanctuary. He wanted a place where English Catholics could live without fear. He named it Maryland, in honor of King Charles's wife, Queen Henrietta Maria. George died before the king could sign the official charter, so the heavy lifting fell to his son, Cecil Calvert. Cecil stayed in England to manage the politics, but he sent his younger brother Leonard across the ocean to lead the expedition. On November 22, 1633, to ships the Ark and the Dove set sail. It was a perilous 4-month journey. Finally, in March of 1634, they landed at St. Clement's Island in the Potomac River. There, they celebrated the first Catholic Mass in the English colonies. They hadn't just founded a new territory, they had founded a haven. But this dream of peace would be challenged almost immediately. To understand Maryland, we have to understand the specific moment in time when the Ark and the Dove dropped anchor. It was March 25, 1634. The location was St. Clement's Island in the Potomac River. When those 140 settlers stepped onto the sandy shore, they were doing something illegal in almost every other part of the British Empire. They were holding a Catholic Mass, led by Leonard Calvert, the younger brother of Lord Baltimore. The settlers weren't looking for a fight. They were looking for a home. Unlike the English settlers in Jamestown, Virginia, who had a tumultuous and often violent relationship with the indigenous Powhatan Confederacy, the Marylanders took a different approach. They sailed further downriver to a Yaucomico village. The Yaucomico people were actually in the process of moving away to avoid raids from the neighboring Susquehannock tribe. Seeing an opportunity for mutual benefit, Leonard Calvert negotiated a purchase. He didn't just seize the land, he bought it with axes, hoes, and cloth. The settlers moved into the existing longhouses of the village, living side by side with the remaining Yaucomico for months. They renamed the village St. Mary's City, which became Maryland's first capital. This cooperation was vital. While Jamestown starved during its starving time, Maryland flourished immediately. The Yaucomico taught the settlers how to plant corn and tobacco in the rich tidewater soil. By the very first harvest, Maryland was actually exporting corn to New England. It was a golden start. The colony was designed as a feudal system of manors, where lords owned massive tracts of land, but the abundance of the land itself began to democratize the people. However, the religious peace Lord Baltimore dreamed of was fragile, and the English Civil War back home was about to spill over into the Chesapeake. While Maryland was founded by Catholics, the majority of the indentured servants and laborers arriving were Protestant. Tensions were naturally high. Lord Baltimore knew that if the Protestants complained to the British Parliament, he could lose his charter. To protect his Catholic haven, he did something radical. In 1649, the Maryland Assembly passed an act concerning religion, later known as the Maryland Toleration Act. It is often cited as a precursor to the First Amendment. The act made it a crime to harass someone based on their religion specifically. It imposed fines for calling people names like heretic, idolater, or popish priest. It guaranteed freedom of worship for all Trinitarian Christians. It wasn't total freedom, it didn't protect non-Christians, but, for the 17th century, it was revolutionary. But a piece of paper couldn't stop the violence of the era. In England, King Charles I was beheaded, and Oliver Cromwell's Puritan forces took control. This emboldened anti-Catholic sentiment in Maryland. A Protestant ship captain named Richard Ingle seized St. Mary's City in 1645. He rampaged through the colony, burning Catholic chapels, looting manors, and sending the Jesuit priests back to England in chains. This period became known in Maryland history as the plundering time. The colony descended into anarchy for 2 years until Leonard Calvert returned from exile in Virginia with a mercenary force to retake the city. But the peace didn't last. By 1654, Puritans had seized the government again, repealed the Toleration Act, and outlawed Catholicism entirely in the very colony founded for it. This culminated in the Battle of the Severn in 1655, a skirmish near modern-day Annapolis, where Puritan forces crushed the pro-Baltimore Loyalists. It would take years of legal wrangling in London for the Calverts to regain control and restore the Toleration Act, proving that Maryland's early history was anything but quiet. By the mid-1700s, Maryland was thriving on tobacco, but it had a major problem. Nobody knew exactly where Maryland ended and Pennsylvania began. The original charters given to the Calvert family, Maryland, and the Penn family, Pennsylvania, had overlapping definitions, based on maps that were geographically incorrect. This wasn't just a paperwork issue. It was a shooting war. Settlers on the border, specifically in the Susquehanna Valley, didn't know who to pay taxes to. This led to Cresap's War in the 1730s, a series of violent border skirmishes led by a Marylander named Thomas Cresap, who was so tough the Pennsylvanians called him the Maryland Monster. He built a fort, defended it with armed men, and claimed land for Maryland well north of the current border, near modern-day Philadelphia. To stop the bloodshed, the two families hired world-class experts, Charles Mason and Jeremiah Dixon. These weren't just surveyors, they were astronomers. Between 1763 and 1767, Mason and Dixon embarked on one of the greatest scientific feats of the age. They hacked through dense old-growth forests, hauling sophisticated telescopes and heavy limestone markers. Every 5 miles, they placed a crown stone, a massive marker with the Penn coat of arms on one side and the Calvert coat of arms on the other. They used the stars to calculate the latitude with incredible precision, creating the straightest line ever drawn on a map up to that time. While they intended to just settle a property dispute, they accidentally created a cultural scar. The Mason-Dixon line became the definitive boundary between the slaveholding South and the free North. For Maryland, the line secured its northern border, but it also physically and metaphorically trapped the state between two worlds, a position that would tear the state apart a century later. When the American Revolution began, Maryland was one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the cause. In fact, Maryland declared independence from Great Britain in June 1776, a month before the signing of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia. But the state earned its nickname, the Old Line State, on a battlefield in New York. It was August 1776, the Battle of Long Island. This was the first major battle after independence was declared, and it was a disaster for the Americans. The British Army, vastly superior in numbers and training, had outflanked George Washington. The Continental Army was in a panic, retreating through the Gowanus Creek marshes. If the British could cut off the retreat, the war would end right there with the capture of Washington's entire army. The only thing standing between the British and the fleeing Americans was a single regiment, the 1st Maryland Regiment, led by Major Mordecai Geist. There were about 400 of them. While the rest of the army ran, the Marylanders turned around. They didn't just hold their ground, they charged. They fixed bayonets and charged the British line at the Quarterly House not once, not twice, but 6 times. From a nearby hill, George Washington watched through his spyglass as the Marylanders were slowly wiped out. He famously said, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." Of the 400 men who charged, only a handful survived. They bought roughly 1 hour of time, but that hour allowed Washington to evacuate his army to Manhattan under the cover of fog. The sacrifice of the Maryland 400 saved the American Revolution, cementing Maryland's reputation for elite infantry that would last throughout the war. After the Revolution, Maryland's economy began to shift. While the Eastern Shore and Southern Maryland were still dominated by tobacco plantations and slavery, the city of Baltimore was becoming a different beast entirely. It was a boomtown, the fastest-growing city in the United States, built on shipbuilding and flour milling. And in 1812, Baltimore became a pirate's nest. When the War of 1812 broke out against Britain, the U.S. Navy was tiny. They couldn't hope to fight the Royal Navy head-on. So, the U.S. government issued letters of marque to private ship owners, authorizing them to hunt British merchant ships. Baltimore embraced this role with fervor. The shipyards at Fells Point produced a specific kind of vessel, the Baltimore Clipper. These schooners were designed for one thing: speed. They were sleek, sharp, and oversailed, able to outrun almost anything the British Navy could throw at them. Baltimore privateers captured over 500 British ships during the war. They caused so much damage to the British economy that the British press called Baltimore a nest of pirates. This success made Maryland a target. By 1814, the British had defeated Napoleon in Europe and turned their full attention to the US. They decided to crush the nest of pirates once and for all. A massive British fleet sailed into the Chesapeake Bay. They landed troops and marched on Washington, D.C., burning the White House and the Capitol. But everyone knew Washington was just a symbolic victory. The real prize, the money, the ships, and the industry, was in Baltimore. As the British fleet turned its guns toward the Patapsco River, the people of Maryland prepared for a fight to the death. September 1814. The British plan was a two-pronged attack. A land army would march on Baltimore from North Point, while the Royal Navy would destroy Fort McHenry, the star-shaped fortress guarding the harbor entrance. On land, the Maryland militia met the British at the Battle of North Point, while the Americans eventually retreated. Maryland sharpshooters managed to kill the British commander, General Robert Ross. The death of their leader threw the British Army into confusion, stalling their advance. That left it up to the Navy. On September 13th, the British ships anchored just out of range of Fort McHenry's cannons. For 25 hours, they unleashed hell. They fired over 1,500 cannonballs, bombs, and rockets at the fort. Inside, Major George Armistead and his 1,000 defenders huddled in the mud as the ground shook. The rain was pouring, the smoke was thick, and the noise was deafening. Watching from a truce ship several miles away was a Maryland lawyer named Francis Scott Key. He had gone to negotiate the release of a prisoner and was now trapped behind enemy lines. He watched the rockets' red glare all night, certain that the fort would surrender. If the fort fell, Baltimore would burn. But when the sun rose on September 14th, the rain stopped, and there, raising above the battered ramparts, was not a white flag of surrender, but a massive, 30 by -42-foot American flag. The British, realizing they could not break the fort, withdrew. Key, overcome with emotion, pulled an envelope from his pocket and wrote a poem titled Defense of Fort McHenry. Set to the tune of a British drinking song, it became the Star-Spangled Banner, immortalizing Maryland's resilience. In the decades leading up to the Civil War, Maryland occupied a strange and volatile position. It was a slave state, yet because of its proximity to the free state of Pennsylvania and its declining reliance on tobacco, it had the largest population of free black citizens in America. In 1860, nearly half of Maryland's black population was free. However, for the enslaved, Maryland was a place of terror. The threat of being sold down the river to the brutal cotton plantations of the Deep South was constant. This desperation made Maryland the most active ground for the Underground Railroad. Two of the most important figures in American history emerged from the eastern shore of Maryland during this time: Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. Frederick Douglass, born into slavery in Talbot County, taught himself to read a crime at the time and escaped north in 1838 by disguising himself as a sailor in Baltimore. He became the voice of the abolitionist movement. Then there was Harriet Tubman, born in Dorchester County. She escaped in 1849, but she didn't stay safe in Philadelphia. Over a period of 11 years, she returned to Maryland roughly 13 times. She navigated the marshes and creeks she had known as a child, risking her life to rescue about 70 enslaved people, including her own family. She was known as Moses. The landscape of Maryland, the Choptank River, the dense swamps, became the battlefield for freedom long before the official war started. When the Civil War began in April 1861, the fate of the United States rested on Maryland. If Maryland seceded, Washington, D.C. would be completely surrounded by Confederate territory. The capital would fall without a shot being fired. The state was deeply divided. Southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore were pro-Confederate, tied to the plantation economy. Western Maryland and the German immigrants in Baltimore were pro-Union. Violence broke out almost immediately. On April 19, 1861, Union troops from Massachusetts were marching through Baltimore to get to D.C. A pro-Confederate mob attacked them with bricks and pistols on Pratt Street. The soldiers fired back. Civilians and soldiers lay dead in the street, the first casualties of the Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln could not afford to lose Maryland. He took unprecedented, arguably dictatorial, action. He suspended the writ of habeas corpus, allowing the military to arrest people without trial. He placed Baltimore under martial law, training cannons from Federal Hill directly onto the city center. When the Maryland legislature met to discuss secession, Lincoln didn't wait for a vote. Federal troops arrested 31 secessionist members of the legislature, the mayor of Baltimore, and even police commissioners, holding them in Fort McHenry. It was a heavy-handed move that suppressed the rebellion, ensuring Maryland remained in the Union whether it wanted to or not. Maryland remained in the Union, but in September 1862, the Confederacy came to Maryland. General Robert E. Lee led his Army of Northern Virginia across the Potomac, hoping to liberate the state and win a victory on Northern soil that would convince Europe to recognize the South. Lee concentrated his forces near the town of Sharpsburg, along a creek called Antietam. On September 17, 1862, the Union Army under George McClellan attacked. What followed was the single bloodiest day in American military history. The fighting was savage. In a sunken farm road, later known as the Bloody Lane, Confederate troops held off wave after wave of Union attackers until the road itself was filled with bodies like a mass grave. At a narrow stone bridge, later named Burnside's Bridge, a small group of Georgians held back an entire Union corps for hours. By nightfall, over 23,000 men were killed, wounded, or missing. The sun set on a landscape of horror. Tactically, the battle was a draw. Lee's army survived. But strategically, it was a Union victory, because Lee was forced to retreat back to Virginia. This victory gave Lincoln the political capital he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation 5 days later, changing the purpose of the war from preserving the Union to ending slavery. Maryland's soil had soaked up the blood that would lead to freedom. Following the Civil War, Maryland reinvented itself. The abolition of slavery destroyed the old plantation system, and the state pivoted hard toward industry. Baltimore became a global hub for steel, canning, and garment manufacturing. It was a gritty, working-class powerhouse. But in 1904, tragedy struck again. On a cold Sunday in February, a discarded cigarette in a dry goods warehouse sparked a fire in downtown Baltimore. The wind was blowing hard, and the fire quickly raged out of control. It burned for 30 hours. Firefighters arrived from as far as New York City to help. But there was a fatal flaw. The hose couplings from other cities did unfit Baltimore's hydrants. They could only watch as 1,500 buildings, the entire business district, burned to the ground. Miraculously, no one died in the blaze, but the city was gutted. Yet, like a phoenix, Baltimore rebuilt this time with wider streets and modern codes. This spirit of resilience carried Maryland through the 20th century. During World War II, the Bethlehem Steel Plant at Sparrows Point was the largest steel mill in the world, building the Liberty ships that won the war. Today, Maryland is a mix of its history. It is the home of the U.S. Naval Academy and the National Institutes of Health. It's a place where you can find watermen harvesting oysters on skipjacks just miles away from top-tier cybersecurity firms. From the Toleration Act to the ashes of the Great Fire, Maryland has always been a small state with a massive role in the American story. They say if you want to understand the United States, you only need to look at Maryland. It is a state that sits on the fault line of history, poised between the North and the South, between the mountains and the sea, and between the past and the future. From the moment the Ark and the Dove landed, Maryland was an experiment. It was an experiment in religious tolerance that faced violent opposition. It was a colony that risked everything to save the Revolution in 1776, earning the name the Old Line State, not because they were old, but because they held the line when no one else could. It is a place of deep contradictions. It is the state that wrote the national anthem, yet was occupied by the Federal Army. It is the state where the Underground Railroad ran through the backyards of slave plantations. But through fire, war, and political turmoil, Maryland has endured. Today, Maryland remains America in miniature, a small state with a massive legacy, reminding us that history isn't just something that happened, it's something that was fought for, inch by inch, on the shores of the Chesapeake. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the history of Maryland. There are thousands of stories hidden in this state that we could uncover today, from the ghost stories of the Eastern Shore to the spy games of the Cold War. What is your favorite fact about the old line state? Did we leave out a piece of history you love? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button and subscribe. We are working our way through the history of every state, and you don't want to miss what's coming next. I'll see you in the next chapter of history.